welcome to our first Kaleidoscope live, proper live, as in that we're actually all together. We are really excited. We are in a secret location in South London. It's a pub somewhere. Although we did want to point out at the beginning that this just looks like a really cold, delicious lager, but it's a movie prop lager. It's actually made of wax. We're not going to drink throughout this. And we've got a couple of interesting papers we're going to talk to you today about. One on the genetics of schizophrenia, but before that we're going to talk about a really interesting and complex and poorly understood thing called mass psychogenic illness. And people have talked about this for a long time, where someone develops what seems like symptoms of a mental health problem, and lots of people around them develop the same thing, almost like it's an infection or contagious. And it's really controversial, but it's been around for hundreds of years. So there was an example called middle-aged dancing plagues. That's because it's from the Middle Ages, not because of dancing. That middle age where your dad and your uncle's doing, there's a wedding, that's a different type of psychological problem. But this is fascinating. In the Middle Ages, you get all these people breaking out. In my head, they're always breakdancing, by the way. I don't know why they're wearing a middle-aged little green caps and stuff, but they're doing breakdance moves. And there's a really strange phenomenon. And then more recently, what you might have read in the news was there was so-called Havanan syndrome, I think it was called, where the US embassy in Cuba and everyone started getting sick with these symptoms, and people said, is this a psychogenic illness, or is it actually Russian interference in some microwave evil weapon? No one knows about that one. But it's kind of gone out of fashion, because the problem was often used by psychiatry in the 20th century, the early part, and what was seen as maybe misogynist or sexist ways, often used against women. There were examples typically from schools and school children, and so it's really gone out of fashion. But we saw a really interesting paper in the journal Brain, which is a very high impact and well respected journal, talking about a new thing called mass media psychogenic illness. So the idea here is something you see on your phone, on Twitter, or whatever it is, can influence behavior around you, and specifically around something called Tourette syndrome. So you might know about Tourette's, where people can have tics about things they say or noises they make or movements. Often starts in childhood. I think in the book, mine's often associated with cursing, but inappropriately, but actually that really doesn't happen for most people. And they're talking in the paper about a German YouTuber, and he's one of the most followed people in Germany, and he does have Tourette syndrome, no one doubts that, but he also had some other interesting symptoms that the authors of the paper, who are experts in Tourette, said is not Tourette syndrome. But what was really fascinating was they report in their clinic that there's been a bit of an epidemic in Germany of other people presenting with the same symptoms, which can't be Tourette's, they say, and they must have picked it up from his videos. So that seems a really interesting starting point. So what did you guys think of that?
I'm still stuck with the image of middle-aged men dancing with what Billy Crystal called the white man's overbite.
That is a plague. That does need to be quashed.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it should stamp it out. The thing that one of the things that fascinated me about this paper and got me really going was it's just the potential. Sukhi summed it up before we started today. What you're describing is advertising, right? If this phenomenon didn't exist, advertising wouldn't work. And I thought that was the smartest thing anyone said about this paper so far. So I'm going to leave Sukhi to defend that point. But I had a look at some of the videos from the YouTube that they mentioned, and not at all having any expertise with Tourette syndrome. You can see what the authors of the paper are saying quite clearly. You can also, by exploring around not just the presentation of what's supposedly the disordered semiology, but you can also look at the culture that's built up around it, the mobile phone app that they've developed, the merchandising, and it does make you wonder if there's a certain amount of cynicism in the content creators here. But the fact that they've seen, how do they describe it in the paper, Dawn? Did they use the word epidemic, or did they?
Oh, yeah.
Because they redefined the term, first of all. They described it as sociogenic rather than psychogenic, which I thought was an interesting.
And I may have thrown in the word epidemic. That may be yours.
Yeah. They say mass social media induced illness, so they keep it relatively light. But actually, the way that they talk about it's very epidemic-ish in terms of language. They're really talking about stopping the spread and this idea that it is a contagion of some nature, a social contagion. We all are interested in human behavior, so for us it's incredibly fascinating. But I think much like you, I didn't see advertising in it, though there is merchandising associated with this and all that. I just looked at where's basic cultural transmission. This idea that, in fact, this is what we do. We see others around us and we emulate for different reasons. In this case, this person is, I'm going to go, very successful, and the people who were in these clinics for this sort of Tourette's-like syndrome, they talked about admiring him for what he had achieved despite his illness. I think what they're trying to show that's really unique in this paper is the social media transmission, the fact that usually these kinds of things are restricted geographically. So you'll have an incident, but it tends to be in a high school or in a contained kind of space. And actually, all of a sudden, we recognize that with social media, there are no more contained spaces. So anyone can access anything, and these things can spread like wildfire. But with that said, does that make it different? Does that make it new? And does that make it bad? Because there's a lot of talk about stopping the spread and the cost to society and all of that. And in this case, of course, because these guys are going to doctors, they're getting diagnoses, they're being sent to clinics and taking spaces that other people with organic illnesses could use. But this is how we learn. We're designed that way. And so the fact that they've picked up this type of behavior, I was likening it with Dan. I was thinking about something called vocal fry. So vocal fry is the latest kind of verbal trend used to, I don't know, keep women down. But effectively, it used to be kind of up-talking that would annoy everyone and discount them and make them less likely to be promoted. Now it's this vocal fry, which is a particular thing with the vocal cords. It creates a sound. And I don't know if I'm doing it, please don't tell me. But with all of that said, this does actually have mass societal implications if we apparently it's quite annoying. And if we are discounting women because of this thing that they've picked up through a social contagion, if you will, there are also mass consequences. So I found this really interesting, but also completely in line with what we know about human behavior and human learning. So tell us about advertising.
I'm not sure I'm the right person to tell you about advertising. It just struck me that in a way, the whole basis of advertising is to have high-profile individuals that you relate to promoting things or behaviour that they're being paid to do. So basically, there are a few interesting things from the outside of the advertising. I might need to come back to that. But in essence, the original sociogenic illness, one of the kind of diagnostic criteria for it was direct contact. That it was always in enclosed environments where you had direct contact with a similar kind of people. And I think one of the things that you've brought out very nicely is that it looks like that direct contact is no longer necessary. That actually people are quite able, and maybe through the pandemic and the increased use of social media and teams to communicate, that they feel that they can form a connection with somebody online. And I think that's clearly much more powerful, I think, for adolescents and children as they're growing. I think they spend a lot more time online, and it's clearly a little bit harder for people for whom it's a little bit unfamiliar. So from older people, I think they don't use the technology quite so much. So it looks like that requirement for it to be direct contagion with behavior is clearly not meaningful in our current kind of circumstances where people can relate quite easily remotely using these kind of social media things. And I guess the second thing that caught my eye was really about it's quite a thing to say you haven't got this disorder, that you are either fabricating or you're exaggerating. And so what's the quality of the data, or how are they justifying that? And that's, I think, something that's worth actually looking at in a little bit more detail, because what they're saying is that they have a long experience of the kind of stereotypical kinds of tics that you might see, both vocal and motor tics that you would see in Tourette's. And they're saying what you're seeing in this sociogenic version of that is too sophisticated, that the speech that's coming out is repeating exactly the things that are seen on these videos, and the utterances that they're using are more complex and very rarely the kind of more basic kind of grunting, simple noises or throat clearing that you would see. They're a little bit too sophisticated. It's like it doesn't match the picture that's associated with the disease in itself. And they also point out something which kind of speaks to your variation in voice, but literally rather than metaphorically, which is they said that the way that the utterances are done is in a lower pitch compared to just a normal pitch. And they're saying that's to allow people around them to be able to distinguish that this is different from, it's something that they need to pay attention to compared to the kind of normal range of speech that they might use. So they use 3 or 4 of these criteria to distinguish why they think that this is something categorically different from Tourette's, because they're keen to be able to say that they've got a clear set of, they've got a clear line of vision about why this is differentiated from that. And so coming back to the point about advertising, if the whole purpose of advertising is to get you to relate to somebody who is highly visible, has desirable traits, now whether that's a footballer or it's a model or it's some kind of sports person or a film star, the idea is that somebody that you want to emulate, and it looks the current fashion is to emulate people who are successful, and this guy is clearly very successful in that environment that he's got. As you said, he's like, I don't know, like the number 2 ranked in terms of his YouTube viewings in Germany.
Is this not a problem? So I take the point, and no one is saying that they're faking it, right? So I think it's really clear. No one is suggesting these people are lingering or making things up. But going back to the original problem about psychogenic illnesses and the fact that psychiatry is often a bit prurient and sensationalist about it or patronizing. Even words like the fashion, I think it's a danger of how you interpret. It's often young people here that there might be people who are relatively vulnerable, need help in different forms. It might be a manifestation of distress, and we don't know because we don't know the people involved. And so my concern with it is, I can buy that it's not Tourette syndrome, that they're experts in it, that's fine. I found that, and I think the authors did a reasonable job describing, but I felt there was a danger that they were dismissing it. So they talked about the kind of culture we live in, the mass media world, the need to have an identity and so forth. I just thought it's potentially patronizing to young people and dismissive of other problems. So I worry about phrases like fashionable or trends or stuff like that. So I think there are dangers about this being misused against young people.
I was thinking it was really great that there is exclusionary criteria, that the illness itself is so well defined that in fact you could differentiate. Because in other situations where there's maybe more gray space, this wouldn't be easily identified. I was wondering about, so you mentioned something that they said, and actually I think it's worth noting. Now this is a preprint, so this might not make it to the official publication, but the authors actually sort of posit that this is a 21st century expression of a culture-bound stress reaction of our postmodern society, emphasizing the uniqueness of individuals and valuing their alleged exceptionality, thus promoting attention-seeking behaviors and aggravating the permanent identity crisis of modern man. So no less than what is happening with modern man. I think we all read it, and I think we could all agree.
You're the only person who understood it.
I have no idea what post-modern
It's doing a lot of heavy lifting here in terms of explanation, and I think that it's too bold of a statement to be backed up scientifically, for sure. And I think you're right that it lends itself to a slippery slope of discounting experience.
So I'm going to now stereotype, so I could be completely wrong, but my expectation is that the authors are going to be greybeards, they're going to be older people, and they're talking about young folk. Well, people our age, they do their own middle-aged dance club, right? But the bad ones. And so it'd be interesting to understand more about what's happening with those young people presented.
Yeah.
And understand it from their perspective and their worldview.
Yeah, and this is testable. I mean, some of this stuff, right, if this really is about the uniqueness of individuals and valuing our alleged exceptionality, again, that is so loaded. But then we absolutely would not see this in collectivist cultures, right? So we could take a look and we could compare cultures that are more bound towards individualistic activity versus more collectivist cultures. There are ways of actually addressing this, but they didn't do that in that paper. And so this is a really interesting observation, and I think it's clinically relevant. I think it's interesting enough that we are talking about it, and the social media bend is also neat, I think. Like, as we've all been thrown into this kind of virtual working world, right? The idea, could it even work? I mean, we were all supposed to be this. The Kaleidoscope Live was always supposed to be this, and it never made it because of COVID. And somehow, actually, we loved it that way. It was great, and we were still able to relate and be friends and talk stuff, and people hold up. I mean, whole relationships happen across the internet. And so the idea that we would have this kind of transmission of cultural information, whether it's illness related or not, isn't a surprise, right? It's not a surprise at all. I don't know if we can load about postmodernism and that kind of stuff. And there's some musings around eco-anxiety and COVID as well that I think are.
I think you're both being a little bit. My opinion would be you're being a little bit unfair on the authors, because I think what they're doing is they've identified something which is interesting, that you're getting this categorization of behavioral symptoms that are arriving at their door being under the framework of a disorder, and they're saying it's not the disorder, this is something different, and they're trying to make sense of that. And this, if you're trying to make sense of it, you've got the observation which says this is not Tourette's, and it looks like it's related to this video presentation. So that's fine. They could have finished the paper there to say, okay, thank you, here's an observation, make of it what you will. Yeah. But what they've tried to do is kind of frame it in terms of, well, okay, what makes a psychogenic illness? And they say, well, proximity, and that's no longer relevant. And then they say, normally it's associated with some level of stress. And then they've gone to look to see, well, what stresses are there? And they haven't pinned those down to these people, and I think it's fair for you to point that out, that it's not, they didn't identify these folk and say, when we spoke to them, they're all terrified of the fact that, global warming is happening, and that's something that concerns us, and we want people to pay attention, and nobody's doing that. But they're saying, they're just contextualizing their data for you to try and think, what is there out there which is concerning young people? And I think that's fair. Actually, that is a reasonable thing that does seem to concern a whole bunch of younger people, perhaps more than older people, who have accepted the fact that the lifestyle they lead is what they want to continue, and somebody else should change.
Yeah, notwithstanding the fact that we're all going to attend weddings and dance badly, according to Derek. This thing I noticed in my behaviour during the pandemic, I started waving at the end of Zoom meetings. I haven't waved to anybody.
That's true. He's never waved to us.
I barely acknowledge the existence of my peers when I'm walking down the street. But so this weird waving, and I can't inhibit it. It happens every time I'm on a Zoom meeting. I'm like, seriously? And it's weird. Every time I do it afterwards, I'm just like, why am I doing this? So that's why it strikes a chord, is because I think all of us recognise our own behaviours in it. But I think I do agree with Dawn. I mean, the statement here is, it can be assumed this is triggered by co-anxiety. My eyes have failed me. Eco-anxiety, COVID-19 pandemic, and further challenge to postmodern society. In this paper, they're very clear they're going to prepare a different paper where they're going to present data, right? Yeah. So this is a Datafree paper, okay? So it's an announcement of a bigger project. And I agree with everything that you said, Sukhi. It is really interesting, but I just think they overplay their hand a bit on the significance of it. They could, I'm not saying they do think this, but they could be just annoyed at the number of people coming to their clinics who don't have the disorder that they treat. For goodness sake, we need to get, this is not...
I sense a little bit of annoyance, but maybe that's me reading into it.
Again, I'm reading into it. They don't give any data. There's a lot of personal communication citations in it, so it makes it hard to read it other than an advert for a phenomenon, and that's what got us discussing it, and that's super exciting and cool. But then I think if there's no data and you're talking, in the way that they should just avoid the speculation, and the paper still stands, right? I don't even know what a postmodern society is, or what modern man is.
What would be your hypothesis? So this has been spread by mass media, and now there's a pushback in mass media that people who do that are faking it. How is that going to modify behaviour?
No, I'd like to go back to the point that actually just a little bit earlier than the one you're making now. So they looked at the demographics of the people presenting with this slightly unusual behaviour, the non-Tourette's, sociogenic illness. And they say in Germany, there's a 50-50 preponderance between the two genders, between male and female. And so 50% male, and which is unusual from their point of view. And then they collaborated with folk in Canada, and there the proportion of the people presenting with a similar phenomenon is a ratio of 9 to 1 female to male. And in Canada, you ask, what's the difference? Are they not watching this video? And the answer is that they have a female equivalent of this guy who is, again, following the same model, being very prominent in the. And so, at least tangentially, they're providing some weak data to suggest that actually it looks like it's driven by this social desirability rather than things. And also, I mean, this was one of the things that came up while we were discussing it before, was had this guy only had 5 followers and wasn't famous, it wouldn't have been desirable. So your premise your hypothesis that you're looking at would be, you can see this behavior increasing in a ratio to the desirability of the person and their fame, perceived fame and success. And therefore, because then relating to that makes you feel like you're different, and especially if people like some of those.
So we're not going to start any from the Kaleidoscope webinars. We need more followers before we can create a psychogenic.
I think that's great. I think if this is true, the other thing we should see is anybody who's watched the Kaleidoscope should start now waving.
Yes.
Like that. A little bit like Teletubbies.
That's our cue to move on to our second paper. So we're going to spend less time on this one, but it's a complex one in different ways, and it's genetics and schizophrenia. What do we know about it, and what does this paper add? And I'm looking at Sukhi in the sunshine here.
So one of the nice things about being live, I guess, is that it's real sunshine. It's real sunshine, and it really means that you can't see a single thing, or read my notes. So I mean, so we know that schizophrenia is genetic, at least a significant component of it, in the sense that if you have identical twins, if one has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the other one is more likely to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and that we can put a number on that. And so people have been really interested to think, well, what drives that? Can we really understand the genetics of schizophrenia? That's been going on for several decades now. And one of the clear results out of that is there's not one gene that determines whether you develop schizophrenia or not. And that makes it quite difficult to then understand how can it be kind of heritable in this fashion. And actually, there isn't a nice, easy answer to which gene drives that. We can't predict who's likely to get that. But what we have done is, as the number of subjects in our studies has increased, in the kind of last large data set of patients with schizophrenia compared to a bunch of healthy controls, there are around 270 individual loci on the genome which are significantly associated with the illness to a very, very small degree. So one of the questions that's come up over time is, well, is there a way, presumably they must all interact, right? They must work together to cause the illness. If an individual is not causing it, then maybe it's a mixture of these things. And that then becomes quite a complex statistical problem. And a simple way of approaching that has been to develop, over the last 10 years probably, is to develop this idea of a polygenic risk score, which is, can we add these 270 loci and summate them, put them together in one form to say, this is a picture or a profile of people who may have a greater risk of developing schizophrenia than others, and that's been validated in some studies that is related to the illness. If you use this particular model, it's accurate for explaining some of the variants in the illness. Not a huge amount, but generally in the order, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, in the order around 7% of the variants can be explained there. So then that brings you up nicely onto the question, well, if this polygenic risk score is related to the development of schizophrenia, what's the mechanism? And so the current kind of hierarchy is that it looks like this genetic profile of polygenic risk score will be related to certain changes in brain structure and function. those changes in brain structure function will impact the kind of neural networks that are subserving psychological processes, and a disturbance in those psychological processes will culminate in the symptoms that are usually associated with schizophrenia, such as either hallucinations and delusions, or amotivation, or cognitive dysfunction. And so what this study tries to do is pick the largest sample of folk with a polygenic risk score and look at that polygenic risk score in the largest sample of brain imaging data that we have from the UK Biobank to see if they can derive what that mechanism may be, that middle step between genes and structure. So they don't go as far as looking at the psychological processes, don't go as far as looking at behavior, they're not looking at patients with schizophrenia, they're just doing that first step to look at what the phenotype may be of this polygenic risk score. And they use a range of metrics in terms of their brain imaging, some of them larger, kind of macrostructural as they call it, and some of them microstructural, which are looking at a little bit more at a finer grain level within brain structure. And they show that this polygenic risk score is related to changes in both of these, both in the macrostructure and in the microstructure, but in particular aspects of the microstructure which are related to kind of neural integrity. And then what you do with that data in the next step is what's the relationship, which is not in the paper, but forms the next logical step, I guess, is to say, well, how does this neural density measures that they've identified as being significant, how do they map onto the psychological processes and the neural networks? And that would require a more functional approach to look at functional relationships between different regions of the brain, looking at neural networks and so on. So I thought it was a really interesting paper in drawing together the literature from these kind of interesting areas, approaching it in a really large sample, which has always been the criticism of genetic work, and also to some degree imaging work, and performing that early stage that's necessary in order for you to kind of refine your hypothesis and map those onto patients and symptoms. I'm just going to move out of the sunshine then, so I can see you.
We'll move the sunshine on to someone else. Who wants to follow up on that? Any thoughts on the paper?
Yeah, I don't want to be that guy, but since I am, that's just how it's going to come out. So what the point you articulated, Sukhi, which is about constructing a hierarchy of levels of explanation. And the lovely thing about this paper is it attempts to be the glue between at least two levels of those explanations. That's super exciting. The thing that's always, I'm not a geneticist, so I'm not sure I'm really qualified to make this statement, but they're using qualitative trait here. So their PRS score is developed from, I forget how many, it's tens of thousands of patients who have a positive categorical diagnosis of schizophrenia.
69,363 to be precise.
Largely European descent, I think 80% Europeans.
Yeah, actually, I mean, that's quite an interesting thing, because one of the things that struck me, reminded me of that, was that they excluded anybody who wasn't effectively white, I think, in the study.
There was some exclusion, I forget.
Because the UK Biobank is so European based, so it wouldn't have been meaningful to take polygenic risk scores of the GWAS data from non-European folk and then apply it to them. So I think they excluded that. So it was one of the things one of the limitations you think about is, well, what does that mean for how representative the results of this complete? So sorry for interrupting you, but that just reminded me of that.
So that I was about to, literally that's talking about representativeness. So the idea that you're building bottom up from in levels of explanations, it's interesting. The final barrier that you articulated, Sukhi, the final two levels were how you take observable behavior and neural networks, or cognitive processes embedded in neural networks. So neural networks, observable cognitive or putative cognitive mechanisms, and then observable behaviors. That's the bit that's going to be, we're working our way up to that. And this is the thing that strikes me about PRS scores, is they derived their PRS score, which is a weighted linear sum, so it's just like a regression, it just adds together, however many SNPALs that you want to sum to give you a final overall univariate score. But that's done on the assumption that 65,000 people, or whatever the number was, qualitatively and categorically have schizophrenia. Yeah. So, and that's going to be, for me, so you develop a PRS score using that. You take that PRS risk score, you then apply it to the biobank data set where people don't have that diagnosis of disorder. So it's really elegant. Initially, that threw me completely, and I thought, what's the point? But then it struck me, oh, hang on, now I get it. Is you're developing a PRS in a essentially quotes unquote normal population, and then you're looking for structural, micro and macrostructural MRI correlates on that. But if you ever get it going to those last two levels that you've articulated, if you're developing the whole foundation, all the preceding levels, the antecedent levels, or the lower level levels, if all of them are developed on the assumption.
So I missed that. What did you say?
Lower level levels. One combination of those things. If you've done that from the outset, assuming that you will arrive, the top levels of your explanation can be explained in terms of a characteristic that you either do or do not have. Like, I have brown eyes, not blue eyes, right? But it strikes me that the phenotype of schizophrenia, which even that is a hotly contested topic, whether or not that term is still fit for purpose, whether it describes the broad presentation of the vaccine, hard to tell. And even within standard diagnostic codes, we've got more than one category. It's not just schizophrenia. Yeah, it's F20.0 for everyone, right? So that's the thing that makes me feel that the project, not the paper, the project as a whole is on slightly flaky foundations, because there's an expectation when we get up to the top level of that hierarchy, we can say, oh, fantastic, now we have a PRS risk score that predicts, the risk for an individual in 3%, or explains 3% of the variance in the model, right? Not validated in a population sample, but just a diagnostic from the model. And then, schizophrenia versus not schizophrenia, which is, it strikes me as too coarse-grained. So I wonder if we're going, we're building on rocky foundations.
If I've understood you correctly, so you're saying that schizophrenia is just so heterogeneous anyway, in terms of the kind of behavioural profile that's going to be presented, that it's a bit tricky just to treat it as a kind of, to have a binary outcome. So basically you either have schizophrenia or you're not. And therefore, the chances of you finding something meaningful in those higher level networks, which observe psychological function and behaviour, becomes quite a difficult task, because it's not going to be this one-to-one mapping.
That's my expectation.
So what would be the way around that? Would it be to look at, not at schizophrenia, but to look at some characteristic that's picking a feature that you think is a bit more...
How many times have we talked about that in the decade or so tenure of our friendship? So this is what our doc's about, right? And I know it's, it waxes and wanes in popularity, but it seems to me it would be interesting to look at a group of people who have, for example, disorganized thought and speech. That would be an interesting thing to look at. And then to look at, either top down or bottom up, it's up to you. But that's a differentiated phenotype in an important way that has clinical relevance. We see that particular presentation in people who suffer with these illnesses. So it strikes me as interesting. And again, with perceptual abnormalities and hallucinations, again, that's also an interesting thing. And you don't need to know a lot about the epidemiologist to know that it doesn't present one simple binary yes/no cluster. You don't have patients who have schizophrenia or not. So I think that's the thing that interests me, and particularly when you're dealing with really small signals. And I think the PRS literature openly acknowledges that these non-Mendelian type analyses, they're quite openly acknowledge that you're explaining very small proportions of variance.
What is non-Mendelian?
That's my cue to bring this to an end. We have a secret code word when the conversation's getting too complex. We say non-Mendelian. So I'm going to draw to a close, because the Kaleidoscope and Mosley Learning team have to go do a dancing praise in the pub here. But thank you for joining us, and we will see you next month, we hope.
Now we wave.
Yeah, no,
Bye.